We're going to talk about a time period in history called the Reformation. The Reformation is a time when the Catholic Church in Europe, and really worldwide, ends up splitting. It's going to happen in the 1500s, and there are several reasons why it takes place. The Catholic Church for several centuries before had been having problems for a number of reasons. There are four major reasons we're going to look at. The first one is that wealthy merchants challenged the church's restrictions on something called usury. Usury means to loan money. And as we talked about when we talked about the Renaissance, what ended up happening was there were a lot of bankers, primarily in the northern part of Italy and in the rest of Europe as a whole, that wanted to loan money to people. They couldn't do it. As banking started to come in, the church said, you are not allowed to loan people money at interest, which is the definition of usury. So a lot of those wealthy merchants who had now moved up into the middle class from just being common everyday people got very upset with the church about that. The second thing is the princes in places like Germany and England and really in all of Northern Europe started to get very upset about the fact that the church, the Catholic Church, was dominated by Italians. All of the higher positions in the church were being handed to Italians over and over and over again, and it was almost like an Italian dynasty that took place within the church. The next was that the church itself had great wealth and power. There were a number of popes that got very upset about the fact and actually looked at the church and said, we are opening ourselves up to great criticism here because the gospel of Jesus had talked quite a bit about looking out for your neighbor and for making sure that people didn't live in excess, have all kinds of extra luxury items and so on. And yet the church was the wealthiest organization within Europe. And so all this wealth and all this power seemed hypocritical to a lot of people. The fourth reason that we see for the Reformation, or the split in the Catholic Church to take place, is the fact that there was a lot of corruption within the church. One of the major things that happened was the church was selling in a lot of places across Europe. They were selling something called indulgences. Now, an indulgence is a pardon for sin. So it would basically be like if somebody went out, committed some kind of sin against the church, they would go to a priest, and the priest would say, you can either do penance for that sin, or I'll just sell you a pardon. And what happened was there were a number of friars that were making it look as if people bought these indulgences, they were actually buying their way to salvation or buying somebody else's way out of a Catholic belief called purgatory. So as we stated, the Reformation is a time period in Europe where there is a split in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church splits into two groups, Catholics and Protestants, or people that continue to follow the Catholic Church, and people that protest the Catholic Church or break away from the Catholic Church, which is where we get the word Protestant. Protestants followed this man, a man named Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German priest, and he became convinced that the Catholic Church was interpreting the Bible incorrectly. Martin Luther was upset about some of the issues we just discussed that were taking place in the Catholic Church in the 1500s and had been taking place for about 200 years before that. Martin Luther wrote a document entitled the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses were 95 statements that he had for the Catholic Church, 95 issues that he wanted to bring up with the Catholic Church, and he nailed this list to the wall of a church, to the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany, the northern part of Germany. And basically these 95 statements can be summed up in three basic statements. He believed that people were saved or were headed to heaven based on their faith, not their works. In other words, the Catholic Church had been preaching that people had to live a certain way in order to achieve salvation. Martin Luther felt that no matter how hard he tried, he would never live up to the standards that were listed in the Bible, and as he read the Gospels or read the New Testament of the Bible, he became convinced that the teachings of Jesus said your salvation is about faith, not about works. The second thing he said has to do a lot with the printing press at the time, which is that the Bible is the final authority. Before this, the Bible was only written in Latin. Now the Bible is going to be written in German, it's going to be written in French, and it's going to be written in English. And what that means is that the common person can now read the scriptures for themselves, can read the Bible for themselves, and they don't need a Catholic priest or a scribe that is trained in Latin to actually break it down and read it for them. The last thing the 95 Theses said is that all humans are equal before God. The Catholic Church had this hierarchy going on, and by hierarchy I mean within the church there was the Pope at the top. Under the Pope came cardinals, and then came bishops, and so on and so forth, all the way down to local priests and common people. Martin Luther said that's not a correct way to interpret the Bible. He said there is God, and below God there is everyone else, and nobody is above anybody else. So all humans are equal, or equality before God was the third part of the 95 Theses. When these 95 Theses are nailed up, it is going to spark a huge war within Germany and a big split, like I said, within the church, okay? And it's going to have profound effects all over Europe. One major place that it had effects was in Switzerland. As people, because of the printing press, as people were exposed to the 95 Theses, there were people like John Calvin who actually took these ideas and organized them. John Calvin wrote a book called The Institutions of the Christian Faith, in which he actually took the ideas of Martin Luther and took them a step further. He said not only are people saved by faith but not works, but in addition to that, he believed in this idea of predestination. Predestination is the idea that God chose before the beginning of time who would be saved and who wouldn't. The way he phrased it is, God chose who would be saints and who wouldn't be a saint. In other words, your eternal place, whether you were going to heaven or to hell, was not based on anything you did, not based on your works, but it was based on whether or not God chose you at the very beginning of time. Now, when he told people this, of course, nobody knew who was saved and who was not, and so the Protestants, or those that followed John Calvin and those that followed Martin Luther, were going around looking for signs that they were actually the ones that were saved. This becomes known as the Protestant work ethic. In other words, the Protestant work ethic said you are saved by your faith, not by your works, but if you are saved by faith, your works will become evident to everybody else. In other words, works follow the faith, or follow the fact that you have been chosen through this predestination. So that's what we mean by a Protestant work ethic. You will do good works and you will work hard in life to prove that you are one of the chosen. So John Calvin's work in Switzerland very much organizes the Protestant movement. It is Martin Luther who breaks away from the Catholic Church. It is John Calvin, through what we would call Calvinism, that organizes the Protestant beliefs. The next place that there is a profound impact of Martin Luther is going to be the country of England. King Henry VIII is the King of England at the time, and a lot of people are familiar with the fact that King Henry VIII had 6 different wives. Well, at this point, when the 95 Theses were posted, King Henry only was married to the first time. He was married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. And what happens is King Henry wants a male heir. He wants a son. Catherine of Aragon has only given him a daughter named Mary, and King Henry really is in love with a younger woman named Anne Boleyn at the time. And so he wants a divorce. Because King Henry is Catholic, like most of the rulers in Europe at that point, he goes to the Pope, and he asks the Pope, who's located in Italy, for an annulment, or for a divorce, essentially. King Henry seeking the divorce is going to cause him to break away from the Pope in Rome, because the Pope in Rome is going to say, no, you are married like everybody else in Europe, and I will not grant you a divorce. There's a lot of politics involved in that decision, but basically the Pope tells him, no, you are to remain married. King Henry wanted his way, And so what King Henry does is he breaks away from the Catholic Church. He now has an option because Martin Luther has started this new Protestant religion. To this day, England as a country is a Protestant. England is a Protestant country because of the work of King Henry through his divorce. They weren't the best motives, but that's what ended up happening. What Henry is going to do very smartly is he is now going to put the church under his power. Okay, so he's going to head the National Church of England. That is going to be a Protestant church. There's a document actually signed in England called the Act of Supremacy, which makes King Henry the head of the National Church in England. And then he is going to confiscate all of the church lands within England. If you were to take all of the church lands in England at that time, they made up over 20% of the overall land in England, just what the church owned. And so what King Henry did was he took all of this land and he gave it to his supporters, which actually solidified his power even more, made Henry more powerful.